In the shadowed alleys and bustling streets of early 20th century New York, one man rose not with the roar of a gun, but with the quiet precision of a mind that calculated every move. Lucky Luciano, later hailed as the architect of modern organized crime, was a figure who commanded respect without shouting, who imposed authority without overt violence, and who reshaped an entire criminal underworld simply by thinking several steps ahead of everyone else. From the outside, he appeared calm, even unremarkable, a man in a suit, walking down the street with the same measured gait as any other Italian immigrant from the Lower East Side. Yet beneath that composed exterior lay a mind both ruthless and visionary, capable of seeing opportunity where others saw chaos, and capable of bending men and circumstances to his will with nothing more than strategy and psychological leverage. The era into which Luciano was born was a time of tumult and upheaval. Immigrants poured into New York City in search of the American dream, only to find crowded tenements, grueling labor, and a social hierarchy that often left them powerless. Crime in many neighborhoods was not merely an act of rebellion, it was a survival mechanism. Violence was a language everyone understood, and respect was the currency by which the streets operated. In such an environment, only the cunning survived and only the bold dared to rise. Luciano, from a young age, observed and absorbed the rhythms of this world, learning when to act, when to retreat, and most importantly, how to manipulate situations so that power came to him almost effortlessly. Unlike the brash, volatile gangsters of his day, he rarely drew attention to himself. There were no public displays of brutality, no flamboyant assertions of dominance in crowded bars or on street corners. Instead, he cultivated relationships, forged alliances, and quietly assessed his rivals. By the time he was in his 20s, Luciano had mastered the delicate art of influence, knowing whom to trust, whom to manipulate, and when to strike. This quiet mastery set him apart from every other figure in the Italian-American underworld. While others relied on fear and intimidation alone, Luciano understood the subtler levers of control, loyalty, respect, and the careful application of pressure, both psychological and social. To those who would later become his allies and enemies, Luciano seemed almost untouchable. He moved through the chaotic, violent world of organized crime with a grace that belied the dangers surrounding him. Every decision he made was calculated, every risk measured, and every alliance weighed for maximum advantage. In many ways, his life became a chessboard, with friends and foes alike as pieces to be positioned, sacrificed, or protected depending on the play of the moment. The genius of Luciano lay in his patience. Unlike many of his contemporaries who burned bright and fell fast, he understood that the greatest power often came not from immediate action, but from strategic planning, timing, and a keen understanding of human nature. By the time he became known as the Quiet Don, Luciano had already achieved something unprecedented. He had risen to the top of one of the most brutal, fragmented criminal landscapes in history without ever needing to brandish his authority with overt violence. His was a rule of intellect over impulse, of influence over force. It was this combination, a mind both daring and disciplined, a heart that could calculate betrayal without succumbing to emotion, and an instinct for survival honed by years on the streets, that would allow him to redefine organized crime forever. The story of Lucky Luciano is not just a story of crime. It is a story of strategy, psychology, and power wielded with a subtlety that remains unmatched in criminal history. The streets of Brooklyn in the early 1900s were a world apart from the gilded image of the American dream. Tenements rose like stone cliffs, crowded and decaying, filled with the cacophony of immigrant voices, children playing amid the filth, and the ever-present hum of desperation. It was here, in the Lower East Side, that Charles Lucky Luciano first opened his eyes to a world that demanded both cunning and toughness for survival. Born into a poor Italian immigrant family, he witnessed the daily struggle of his parents, who worked long hours for meager wages while trying to shield their children from the harsh realities outside their narrow apartment walls. Yet shielding could only go so far. Outside, the streets taught lessons that school could not, lessons that would shape the boy into a man capable of seeing opportunity in chaos. From an early age, Luciano absorbed the rhythm of Brooklyn life. He observed the barbers who doubled as bookmakers, the pushers who navigated the narrow alleys like kings of an invisible kingdom, and the local gang leaders who commanded loyalty through both fear and respect. He saw that power did not always belong to the loudest or the strongest, but often to the cleverest. In a world where adults fought to survive, the young Luciano learned quickly that alliances were currency and perception was power. Every glance, every whispered conversation, every subtle shift in neighborhood dynamics was a lesson in human behavior, and Luciano absorbed it all with an intensity that belied his age. Childhood for Luciano was never innocent. While other boys played in the streets without consequence, he understood that life in his neighborhood was a careful negotiation with danger. Fights were not mere displays of bravado, they were survival exercises. Theft, extortion, and minor hustles were not just crimes. They were opportunities to test courage, intelligence, and strategy. Luciano was not merely participating. He was observing, calculating, and refining the instincts that would later make him a master manipulator. His mind, sharp even as a teenager, constantly measured risk, reward, and human behavior in ways that would seem almost unnatural for someone of his age. Education was formal but secondary to the lessons the streets provided. While he learned reading, writing, and arithmetic in crowded classrooms, it was in the alleys and local bars that Luciano received his true schooling. He studied human nature with a meticulous eye, which neighbors could be trusted, which adults wielded hidden influence, and which rivals were likely to fracture under pressure. The neighborhood itself was a classroom of human psychology, teaching him the essential skills of negotiation, patience, and subtle coercion. By adolescence, Luciano had begun experimenting with minor hustles, running errands for local gangsters, delivering messages, and learning the nuances of loyalty and betrayal. Each small success reinforced the lesson that brains, more than brawn, determined who survived and who fell. Family life too left a mark on the young Luciano. His parents, hardworking and disciplined, instilled in him a sense of resilience and ambition, even if they could not shield him from the corruption and violence outside. The dichotomy between home and street created a unique psychological foundation. At home, respect, rules, and structure. Outside, cunning, flexibility, and vigilance. This duality shaped him, fostering a mind capable of compartmentalization, a skill he would later use to separate his public persona from his criminal operations, allowing him to maintain calm even when surrounded by chaos. As he grew older, the streets of Brooklyn became both a proving ground and a playground. Luciano learned quickly that intelligence, charm, and observation could wield as much power as fists or knives. By the time he entered his teenage years, he had already begun to understand the subtle hierarchies of the underworld, recognizing that influence could often be quietly cultivated rather than violently demanded. The young boy who once roamed the crowded tenements would evolve into a man who could command an empire without ever raising his voice. Brooklyn, with its relentless pace and harsh lessons, had forged the first steel threads of the quiet Don's mind, a mind that would eventually outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast every rival in the criminal world. By the time Luciano was entering his late teens, the streets of Brooklyn had become both a playground and a proving ground for his emerging instincts. He had moved beyond mere observation. He was now an active participant in the web of small-time hustles and petty crimes that defined his neighborhood. What set him apart from other teenagers dabbling in mischief was his combination of charm, intelligence, and an uncanny ability to read people. Every interaction was a lesson, every minor encounter an opportunity to test loyalty, measure risk, and practice manipulation. Even small errands for local gangsters, delivering messages, collecting debts, or running seemingly innocuous errands, were training exercises in the delicate balance of power and influence. Luciano's early associations were critical in shaping the man he would become. He fell in with local street gangs, groups that operated with loose hierarchies and brutal enforcement methods. Within these gangs, violence was a currency, and respect had to be earned through daring acts, quick thinking, or sheer audacity. Luciano, however, rarely relied on sheer force. Instead, he studied the behavior of his peers and superiors, learning which individuals wielded influence, which alliances were valuable, and which grudges could be manipulated to his advantage. It was during these formative years that he began to understand one of his most enduring lessons. True power was not about fear alone, it was about perception, control, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. Early criminal ventures for Luciano were small but strategically significant. He learned how to run numbers, participate in minor thefts, and even dabble in bootlegging under the watchful eyes of older gangsters. These ventures allowed him to build a reputation for reliability, intelligence, and subtle ruthlessness. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied on flash and intimidation to assert dominance, Luciano's approach was quiet and methodical. He understood that earning trust, and sometimes fear, through consistent, calculated actions could yield more lasting influence than impulsive displays of aggression. Each minor success added to his growing network of contacts, and each failure taught lessons about timing, discretion, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. By his early 20s, Luciano was already beginning to rise above the chaos of street-level crime. He recognized that the fragmented and violent world of local gangs offered both opportunity and danger. While some of his peers sought to dominate through brute force, Luciano began to envision a different path. One in which power could be centralized, disputes could be negotiated, and control could be exerted without constant bloodshed. He observed the failures of older mob bosses, men who relied solely on fear and outdated methods, and understood that his approach needed to be both cerebral and adaptable. This mindset would become one of his defining characteristics: the ability to foresee consequences, anticipate rival moves, and position himself as the pivotal figure in a world otherwise ruled by chaos. Alliances forged during this period were often as fragile as they were crucial. Luciano learned to navigate a delicate network of loyalties, friendships, and rivalries, understanding that betrayal could come from the most unexpected quarters. He also developed an instinct for identifying potential allies and assessing the value of each connection, recognizing that influence extended beyond immediate friends or enemies. It involved shaping perception across entire networks. In this way, Luciano began to transform from a mere street hustler into a strategist, someone capable of envisioning the broader landscape of power and maneuvering within it with remarkable precision. Mentorship played a pivotal role as well. Older figures in the underworld saw in Luciano a combination of intelligence, charm, and ambition that was rare for someone so young. They introduced him to the finer points of organization, negotiation, and influence, exposing him to the subtleties of leadership that would later define his style. Through these early lessons, he understood that the mafia was more than a collection of violent men. It was a system that could be organized, optimized, and controlled. This perspective, coupled with his innate cunning, set the stage for his future innovations and eventual domination of the criminal underworld. Even in these early years, Luciano demonstrated a remarkable ability to compartmentalize his life. At home, he was the dutiful son, navigating family expectations and the hardships of immigrant life. In the streets, he was an ambitious operator, learning the nuances of human behavior and the mechanics of influence. By balancing these dual realities, he developed a psychological resilience that would allow him to remain calm under pressure, think several moves ahead of his rivals, and maintain authority in situations that would have overwhelmed less disciplined men. These formative years of minor crimes, alliances, and early hustles were not merely a prelude, they were the crucible in which the quiet dawn was forged. They taught him that patience, strategy, and observation could outmatch brute force, that loyalty, when carefully cultivated, could be more powerful than intimidation, and that the path to dominance required both subtlety and vision. By the time Luciano was stepping into his 20s, he was no longer just a street kid navigating Brooklyn's alleys. He was a calculating young man, quietly laying the foundations for an empire that would soon reshape the entire landscape of organized crime in America. As Luciano transitioned into his early 20s, the streets of Brooklyn no longer merely shaped him, they became a stage for his ambitions. By this time he had moved well beyond the realm of petty crimes and minor hustles. He was entering the upper echelons of the Italian-American underworld, where influence, cunning, and strategic alliances determined who thrived and who fell. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied on violence as a primary tool of dominance, Luciano relied on something subtler yet infinitely more effective: the careful orchestration of people, perception, and circumstance. He had learned that power did not have to be loudly declared. It could be quietly accumulated, measured, and deployed at precisely the right moment. Early mentorships with older, established mobsters offered Luciano a window into the mechanics of real power. Men who had spent decades navigating the violent, unpredictable world of organized crime saw in him a rare combination of intelligence, ambition, and charisma. Under their guidance, Luciano learned the nuances of negotiation, the unspoken rules of the streets, and the value of patience. He observed the failures of those who relied solely on brute force, noting that while violence could enforce obedience temporarily, it rarely ensured loyalty or long-term stability. Luciano's approach was different. He sought not just control, but an enduring system where influence could be maintained without constant confrontation. Luciano's rise was also facilitated by his remarkable talent for networking. He understood early that alliances were more than temporary conveniences, they were the lifeblood of a lasting empire. By cultivating relationships across rival factions and seemingly disparate groups, he created a network that extended beyond immediate territory or gang affiliation. Friends, allies, and even former enemies became tools in his growing arsenal of influence. Each connection was carefully assessed for value, loyalty, and potential leverage. In the hands of a lesser man, these relationships might have been fragile and unstable. In Luciano's, they became the threads of a tightly woven web that would eventually encompass the entire New York underworld. By now, Luciano had begun to distinguish himself through his psychological mastery. He was adept at reading men, their ambitions, fears, and weaknesses, and using that understanding to manipulate outcomes without resorting to violence. While others might intimidate or coerce, Luciano could persuade, threaten subtly, or strategically reward loyalty. This ability to influence without overt aggression earned him a reputation for intelligence, foresight, and calm decisiveness. Those who underestimated him because of his quiet demeanor soon discovered that he was calculating, patient, and lethal when necessary. His reputation grew not because of the number of lives he took, but because of the precision with which he orchestrated events, often from behind the scenes, ensuring his dominance was nearly uncontested. During this period, Luciano also began experimenting with organizational innovation. He noticed the chaos that plagued existing criminal structures: gangs constantly at war, leaders unable to maintain order, disputes settled by impulsive violence rather than reasoned strategy. Luciano's mind worked differently. He envisioned a system that would operate almost like a business: clear roles, structured hierarchies, and enforced codes of conduct. He recognized that by introducing rules and consistency into the unpredictable world of crime, he could reduce risk, increase efficiency, and consolidate power. These early experiments in organization would later evolve into the creation of the Five Families and the Commission, innovations that redefined organized crime forever. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's rise was driven by his ability to balance risk and reward with extraordinary precision. He understood that ambition without caution was suicidal in the underworld. Each decision, whether forming an alliance, eliminating a rival, or expanding territory, was measured against potential fallout. By anticipating reactions, preempting betrayal, and carefully orchestrating his moves, Luciano was able to climb higher than any other figure in his milieu without exposing himself to the dangers that claimed so many of his contemporaries. His approach was methodical, almost surgical, and it marked the difference between a transient street boss and a lasting empire builder. Psychologically, this period of Luciano's life also honed his ability to compartmentalize. He could operate in the ruthless, often violent world of organized crime while maintaining a calm, collected exterior. He separated emotion from strategy, understanding that fear, anger, or impulsive pride could destroy even the most promising plans. This detachment was not coldness, it was clarity. It allowed him to make decisions that others could not, to act with foresight where others acted impulsively, and to emerge from conflict stronger rather than diminished. By the end of this formative phase, Luciano had transformed from a street-savvy kid into a calculated strategist, a man whose rise was marked not by reckless violence but by subtlety, intellect, and vision. He had established himself as a force to be reckoned with in New York's criminal underworld, respected by allies, feared by rivals, and always 3 steps ahead of anyone who dared to challenge him. The Quiet Don was no longer just a promising young figure. He was a future architect of an empire, quietly assembling the foundations of a criminal kingdom that would change the face of organized crime forever. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano was no longer merely a rising figure in Brooklyn. He was a strategist on the brink of revolutionizing organized crime in America. The streets, which had once been his classroom, had become a proving ground for his vision. Luciano looked at the fragmented underworld and saw something that no one else did: chaos that could be transformed into structure, violence that could be channeled into profit, and rivalries that could be negotiated into cooperation. He understood that the old ways, loose gangs, impulsive conflicts, and short-lived power struggles, were inefficient, dangerous, and ultimately self-destructive. To dominate, he needed not just strength or fear, but an organized system capable of enduring beyond the life of any one man. Luciano's approach was revolutionary. He envisioned a mafia not as a collection of isolated gangs, each acting independently and often at cross purposes, but as a structured, interdependent enterprise. He began consolidating power quietly, forging alliances with influential figures in each faction, assessing their strengths, weaknesses, and ambitions. By bringing together the most competent and loyal operators from rival gangs, he created a network that was greater than the sum of its parts. Luciano understood the human need for recognition and belonging, and he leveraged it, offering positions of authority and opportunity to those who might otherwise oppose him. In doing so, he sowed loyalty, minimized resistance, and established a framework that could enforce order even when he was absent. The creation of the Five Families was the centerpiece of this transformation. Luciano recognized that territorial disputes were the root of much conflict in New York. By dividing the city into distinct spheres of influence, each led by a capable and trusted leader, he minimized unnecessary friction and created a balance of power that would allow for stability, profit, and cooperation. Each family operated independently in daily operations, but all were accountable to a central authority, a system that would later be formalized as the Commission. This structure was not merely administrative, it was strategic. By institutionalizing rules, protocols, and accountability, Luciano introduced predictability into an unpredictable world, a predictability that allowed him to manipulate events with unprecedented precision. Luciano's genius lay not only in the creation of structure but in the subtlety with which he implemented it. He rarely imposed his authority through overt displays of force. Instead, he cultivated the perception that he was indispensable. Rival leaders who might have seen him as just another ambitious upstart, came to recognize that cooperation with Luciano was in their own best interest. Through careful negotiation, strategic marriages of convenience, and the judicious use of threats, he turned potential enemies into partners. Even those who initially resisted his influence found themselves drawn into his system, not because they were coerced, but because the logic of survival and profit made alignment with him the most rational choice. The Commission, the governing body of the five families, was perhaps Luciano's most enduring innovation. It represented a shift from the chaotic, individualistic style of mob leadership to a model of corporate governance. Decisions about territory, business ventures, and conflict resolution were no longer dictated solely by the strongest or most violent. They were mediated through dialogue, negotiation, and a framework designed to minimize unnecessary bloodshed. This was a profound psychological and organizational innovation. Luciano had created a system in which loyalty was rewarded, betrayal was punished, and power was both structured and diffuse. By embedding checks, balances, and incentives into the very architecture of the mafia, he ensured that the organization could survive, thrive, and expand even as individual leaders came and went. Luciano's empire building also depended on his remarkable ability to anticipate and exploit opportunity. He watched the dynamics of Prohibition-era America with keen interest, recognizing that the illegal liquor trade, gambling, and labor racketeering were not just sources of profit, they were instruments of power. By controlling these enterprises, he could exert influence over unions, politicians, law enforcement, and even rival gangsters. Luciano's vision was comprehensive. He was not content merely to dominate streets and neighborhoods. He sought control over the systems that governed commerce, labor, and social influence. His understanding of leverage, how to use money, information, and fear to shape outcomes, became a defining characteristic of his leadership. What truly set Luciano apart, however, was the psychological sophistication underlying his empire. He did not rely solely on fear or brute force. He understood the human need for respect, ambition, and recognition. By offering opportunities, rewarding loyalty, and selectively punishing disloyalty, he created a culture in which his authority was internalized rather than externally imposed. Allies felt invested, rivals feared consequences, and the broader criminal ecosystem recognized the logic and inevitability of his dominance. In this sense, Luciano ruled not through chaos but through strategy, not through intimidation alone, but through a deeply calculated understanding of human behavior. By the end of this period, Luciano had transformed the mafia from a chaotic collection of gangs into a coordinated, hierarchical empire with rules, systems, and strategic governance. The city itself became a stage upon which he could orchestrate complex operations, mediate disputes, and extend influence with precision and subtlety. His leadership style, quiet, methodical, and psychologically astute, was unlike anything the criminal world had ever seen. Where others relied on brute force or volatile temperaments, Luciano wielded intellect, patience, and influence, creating a foundation that would endure long after he faced the inevitable challenges of law enforcement and internal betrayal. Luciano's rise was more than personal success. It was a redefinition of organized crime itself. He demonstrated that power could be built as much through systems, alliances, and psychological mastery as through guns and violence. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano was no longer merely a rising mobster. He was a revolutionary, quietly reshaping an entire criminal universe according to rules of his own design, laying the foundations for an empire that would endure for decades and set a model for organized crime around the world. By the time Luciano's organizational framework was taking shape, he had already begun transforming the underworld from a chaotic collection of street gangs into a sophisticated business enterprise. The streets of New York were fertile ground for opportunity, particularly during the Prohibition era, when the ban on alcohol created a vacuum that clever operators could exploit for immense profit. Luciano recognized that crime, if structured like a business, could yield far more than just short-term gain. It could provide long-term influence, political leverage, and control over an entire city. To him, gambling dens, illegal distilleries, and union rackets were not merely sources of money, they were instruments to consolidate power, manipulate systems, and command loyalty. Bootlegging during Prohibition became one of Luciano's most lucrative and strategically significant ventures. While others relied on brute force to seize territory or intimidate rivals, Luciano approached the trade with a combination of shrewd planning and careful negotiation. He built networks of suppliers, distributors, and corrupt officials who ensured that his operations ran smoothly. Unlike his contemporaries who often flaunted their control and attracted law enforcement attention, Luciano maintained discretion, moving goods and influence with a level of sophistication that minimized risk while maximizing profit. The alcohol trade provided not just wealth but leverage. Those who depended on his operations, bar owners, speakeasy operators, and politicians alike, became bound to him through both necessity and gratitude. Gambling was another cornerstone of his empire. Luciano recognized early that betting was more than a vice. It was an economic engine capable of generating vast sums while entrenching his influence in every layer of society. Illegal gaming operations allowed him to cultivate relationships with powerful figures, from union leaders to law enforcement officers, by offering stakes, protection, or strategic favors. Each gambling den became a microcosm of his larger empire, a place where loyalty could be tested, influence extended, and networks strengthened. Through these ventures, Luciano demonstrated that crime could be engineered as a system, where every operation reinforced his control and expanded his reach. Labor unions presented yet another avenue for expansion, but they required a different kind of skill. Unlike bootlegging or gambling, union manipulation demanded psychological insight, negotiation, and sometimes subtle coercion. By infiltrating unions, controlling leadership positions, and managing strikes or work stoppages, Luciano could exert influence over industries vital to the city's economy. This gave him leverage far beyond the confines of the criminal underworld, allowing him to influence businesses, politics, and public perception simultaneously. In Luciano's hands, labor became a tool not only for profit but for power, a strategic chess piece that reinforced his position at the top of the hierarchy. What set Luciano apart from other crime figures of his time was the precision with which he integrated these enterprises. Each operation was not isolated, it was part of a broader, interconnected system. Bootlegging revenues funded gambling ventures, gambling networks facilitated union control, and union influence reinforced bootlegging protections. Luciano's genius lay in seeing the criminal ecosystem as a whole and positioning himself at the center. By controlling multiple facets of illegal and semi-legal commerce, he created a self-sustaining empire in which every part supported the other. Competitors who attempted to disrupt one aspect of his operations often found themselves outmaneuvered because Luciano had already anticipated their moves and built contingencies across the network. Equally important was Luciano's understanding of risk management. Unlike reckless operators who exposed themselves to law enforcement or violent reprisals, he carefully calculated every move, anticipating legal and personal consequences. His operations were designed to minimize exposure while maximizing influence. Corruption, bribery, and discreet alliances with politicians, police, and other power brokers ensured that his empire could function largely unimpeded. In this sense, Luciano's criminal activities mirrored a sophisticated business strategy. Diversified investments, strategic partnerships, and contingency planning, all executed with ruthless efficiency. Luciano also recognized the psychological dimension of his enterprises. He understood that power was reinforced not only by wealth or influence but by perception. By maintaining a reputation for both intelligence and strategic ruthlessness, he cultivated an aura that commanded respect from allies and fear from adversaries. His approach to business and crime was therefore inseparable from his mastery of human behavior. Every operation, every negotiation, and every alliance was designed not only to generate profit but also to reinforce his dominance, loyalty among associates, and reputation as a man whose intellect was as formidable as any weapon. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Luciano's empire had grown to encompass a wide range of criminal enterprises, each meticulously organized and mutually reinforcing. Bootlegging, gambling, and labor racketeering were no longer separate ventures. They were interconnected systems that allowed him to exert influence over New York streets, industries, and institutions. The Quiet Don had created a criminal model that was disciplined, strategic and resilient, allowing him to stay ahead of rivals and law enforcement alike. While violence still existed in the world around him, Luciano's power did not rely solely on it. Instead, it relied on foresight, intelligence, and the systematic orchestration of people, money, and influence. This period in Luciano's life solidified his reputation as more than a gangster. It positioned him as a visionary who had turned crime into a sophisticated, multi-layered enterprise. His operations were profitable, yes, but more importantly, they were a means to an end. The consolidation of power, the creation of loyalty networks, and the establishment of a system that could endure beyond his own lifespan. The Quiet Don was no longer simply rising. He was building an empire, a criminal kingdom that would serve as a blueprint for organized crime for decades to come. By the time Lucky Luciano had firmly established his criminal enterprises, he understood that the true measure of power lay not only in wealth or operations, but in the delicate balance of alliances and rivalries that defined the underworld. Every friend was a potential ally, every rival a possible threat, and every decision carried consequences that could reverberate across the city. Luciano's genius was not merely in accumulating power, but in navigating these relationships with a sophistication that few of his contemporaries could match. He recognized early that the streets were not a place for reckless ambition alone. They were a stage upon which diplomacy, perception, and calculated influence could be as effective as brute force. Alliances were the lifeblood of Luciano's strategy. He cultivated relationships with key figures in each of the 5 families, ensuring that his network extended beyond immediate neighborhoods and gangs. Loyalty was never assumed, it was earned through mutual benefit, careful negotiation, and the subtle demonstration of competence and reliability. Luciano rewarded those who supported him with protection, opportunity, and influence, creating a culture of allegiance that was as psychologically binding as it was practical. Allies felt both respected and indebted, understanding that their success was intertwined with the Quiet Don's guidance. In this way, he transformed friendships into strategic assets, ensuring that loyalty was rarely questioned and rarely broken. Yet the underworld was never a place without tension. Rivalries were constant, and betrayal was always a lurking threat. Luciano's ability to navigate these dangers defined his leadership. He observed carefully, listening more than speaking, and evaluating threats based on intelligence rather than impulse. Where others might have responded to provocation with immediate violence, Luciano measured reactions, anticipating consequences and maneuvering in ways that minimized risk to himself while neutralizing enemies. His calm, analytical approach became his trademark. It allowed him to outthink opponents who were stronger, louder, or more ruthless, transforming potential disasters into opportunities for consolidation. Among his most significant rivals were gang leaders who resented his growing influence and threatened the delicate equilibrium he sought to maintain. Some attempted open confrontation, challenging his authority directly, while others sought to undermine him through covert means, spreading rumors, orchestrating sabotage, or tempting his allies with promises of greater rewards. Luciano, however, had mastered the art of preemption. By understanding the ambitions, fears, and psychological weaknesses of those around him, he could anticipate moves before they occurred and position himself advantageously. Sometimes this meant strategic alliances with former enemies. Other times, it required calculated displays of strength that reminded others of the cost of betrayal. Every action was deliberate, every response measured, and every interaction a lesson in control. Psychology played as crucial a role as muscle in these dealings. Luciano understood human nature on a profound level. Ambition, greed, fear, and loyalty were all levers to be manipulated. He exploited these traits to secure obedience, encourage cooperation, and neutralize threats without always resorting to violence. Men who might have acted against him were often co-opted instead, drawn into his sphere through opportunity and subtle pressure. This approach reinforced his reputation as a leader whose intellect could match any opponent's force, a reputation that extended far beyond the 5 families and into the broader criminal ecosystem of New York City. The alliances Luciano formed were not limited to local rivals. They extended into political and law enforcement spheres. Corrupt officials, sympathetic politicians, and even lawmen were integrated into his network, often unknowingly, providing crucial intelligence, protection, and access to resources. By embedding himself in multiple layers of society, he created a protective web that insulated him from immediate threats and enhanced his capacity to manipulate outcomes. These relationships were carefully maintained through a combination of favors, intimidation, and subtle incentives, allowing him to operate with a level of security that was unmatched by his peers. Yet even as he strengthened his position, the stakes continued to rise. Rivalry in the mafia world was never static and alliances were fragile. Luciano understood that power was both a resource and a liability. Too much aggression could provoke backlash, too much leniency could invite disrespect. The genius of his approach was balance. He knew when to act decisively, when to negotiate, and when to let tensions simmer until they could be exploited strategically. In this sense, every relationship, every negotiation, and every confrontation was a game of foresight, a test of both patience and psychological acuity. During this period, Luciano also honed the ability to project authority without overtly exercising it. Men respected him not only because of what he controlled, but because of the perception he cultivated. The quiet Don's calm demeanor, careful speech, and deliberate gestures communicated a subtle, almost imperceptible dominance. Allies felt guided, rivals felt restrained, and the broader criminal world recognized that his influence was pervasive, even if largely invisible. In this way, Luciano leveraged psychology, perception, and strategic action to expand his power far beyond what guns or intimidation alone could achieve. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's mastery of alliances and rivalries had solidified his dominance. He had created a network that integrated loyalty, fear, influence, and opportunity into a single cohesive system. Allies were incentivized to remain loyal, rivals were managed or neutralized, and the architecture of his power extended into virtually every aspect of the criminal and social landscape of New York. Through careful cultivation of relationships, strategic foresight, and psychological insight, Luciano ensured that his empire was not merely strong, it was resilient, adaptive, and enduring. In this environment of constant negotiation and subtle conflict, Luciano proved that true power was not measured by the volume of violence, but by the capacity to control outcomes, manage human behavior, and anticipate challenges before they became crises. Allies and enemies alike became instruments of his strategy, his influence radiating through every corner of the city. In this way, the quiet Don did not merely survive in the brutal world of organized crime. He thrived, mastering the delicate art of relationships, loyalty, and psychological dominance in a landscape where many others faltered and fell. As Luciano's empire grew, so too did the hidden conflicts that simmered beneath the surface of New York's criminal world. While his public persona remained calm and controlled, the underworld was a boiling cauldron of tension, greed, and ambition. Rival factions chafed under his influence, long-standing grudges threatened to ignite, and law enforcement pressure grew ever more relentless. For every ally who pledged loyalty, there was an equal and opposite force plotting betrayal or disruption. Luciano understood that the stability he had built was fragile, and that maintaining dominance required constant vigilance, strategy, and the ability to navigate chaos without being consumed by it. These hidden wars were fought not only with weapons, but with information, influence, and manipulation. Luciano excelled in intelligence gathering, understanding that knowledge was power in the most profound sense. He relied on informants, allies, and even unsuspecting officials to keep tabs on rivals, law enforcement movements, and emerging threats. Every piece of information was carefully analyzed for its strategic value. Decisions were rarely impulsive. Every action was weighed for consequence, opportunity, and long-term impact. In this way, Luciano maintained an advantage over his enemies, often anticipating their moves before they had even committed to them. Violence, when it occurred, was surgical and deliberate. Unlike the chaotic shootouts and street wars that characterized earlier periods of mafia conflict, Luciano's approach was calculated. Each act of violence served a precise purpose: to remove a threat, enforce loyalty, or send a message. Random brutality was avoided. Unnecessary bloodshed was inefficient and risky. By controlling the timing and nature of violent acts, he maintained authority without destabilizing the broader system he had constructed. Men came to understand that any confrontation with Luciano's organization carried a predictable cost, a cost that could be avoided through compliance, negotiation, or strategic alignment. The government, too, applied increasing pressure during this period. Prohibition-era enforcement, combined with public outcry against gang violence and corruption, made the underworld a hazardous environment. Raids, arrests, and surveillance became common, and the constant threat of imprisonment loomed over every operation. Luciano's response was both pragmatic and visionary. He leveraged his network to influence officials, minimize legal exposure, and manipulate public perception. Corruption was not haphazard. It was targeted and strategic, ensuring that the right people at the right levels could be counted on to protect his interests. The intersection of crime, politics, and law enforcement became another battlefield where Luciano exercised subtle but decisive control. Internal tensions also demanded careful management. Even within the five families, ambitions clashed, personalities conflicted, and loyalties shifted. Luciano's skill lay in identifying potential flashpoints before they erupted. He mediated disputes, offered incentives, and applied pressure selectively to ensure that internal conflict strengthened rather than weakened his position. Betrayal was always a possibility, but through psychological insight and strategic foresight, he created an environment in which allegiance to him was rational, desirable, and often inevitable. Even those who disagreed with his methods or envied his power understood that alignment with Luciano offered protection, opportunity, and influence they could not achieve alone. Luciano's ability to manage these hidden wars extended beyond mere survival. It reinforced his reputation as an untouchable force. Stories of rival gang leaders meeting untimely ends, unexplained accidents, or discreet disappearances circulated quietly through the underworld. Yet the Quiet Don rarely intervened personally. Instead, he orchestrated outcomes through proxies, leveraging alliances and psychological pressure to achieve objectives while maintaining distance from direct violence. This approach further enhanced his mystique, making him appear both omnipotent and inscrutable, an untouchable strategist whose influence extended far beyond what most could comprehend. The psychological toll of these hidden conflicts cannot be underestimated. Luciano operated in an environment where betrayal was constant, danger was omnipresent, and missteps could be fatal. Yet he maintained an extraordinary composure, a calm demeanor that concealed the complexity of his operations and the intensity of his calculations. By mastering the emotional landscape of the underworld, fear, ambition, greed, and loyalty, he turned what could have been chaos into a system he could predict, manipulate, and control. His mind became a battlefield where strategy, observation, and foresight determined the outcomes of wars fought in shadows rather than on the streets. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Luciano had established not only a powerful empire, but a model for navigating the hidden wars of organized crime. He had transformed conflict from a random, destructive force into a tool of governance, using violence, influence, and negotiation as instruments of control rather than chaos. Rivals who sought to challenge him learned quickly that the cost of opposition was high and that his network of allies and intelligence made resistance almost impossible. In this environment, Luciano thrived, consolidating power quietly, managing conflict with surgical precision, and ensuring that the underworld remained firmly under his influence. The hidden wars of Luciano's era reveal a dimension of his genius that extended far beyond money or territory. They illustrate a mind capable of operating on multiple levels simultaneously, managing operations, anticipating threats, influencing human behavior, and navigating complex social dynamics. Through these struggles, the Quiet Don demonstrated that true dominance in organized crime depended not on the frequency of gunfire or the display of raw power, but on the ability to control perception, orchestrate outcomes, and remain several steps ahead of every adversary. In doing so, Luciano solidified his position as the most formidable figure in New York's criminal history, a man whose empire was defined as much by strategy and intelligence as by wealth and violence. Even the most carefully constructed empires are vulnerable, and for Lucky Luciano, the seeds of downfall were quietly taking root in the late 1930s. Despite his meticulous planning, strategic alliances, and unparalleled influence, the forces of law enforcement, betrayal, and internal unrest began to converge in ways that no single man, no matter how cunning, could entirely control. The streets that had nurtured him, the network he had painstakingly built, and the loyal allies who had supported him were all part of a system under constant scrutiny. As the pressure mounted, the vulnerabilities inherent in a life built on illegality and secrecy became impossible to ignore. The first cracks appeared in the form of intensified government attention. The rise of federal law enforcement initiatives, fueled by public outrage over rampant organized crime, focused on high-profile figures like Luciano. He had long been aware that his operations skirted the boundaries of legality, but until now, his influence, discretion, and carefully cultivated alliances had insulated him from direct consequences. Suddenly, raids, subpoenas, and surveillance were no longer occasional threats. They became systematic efforts to dismantle the criminal networks he controlled. Luciano's awareness of the looming threat sharpened his strategic instincts, but it also marked the beginning of a new, more dangerous phase of his life. Betrayal, too, began to emerge from unexpected quarters. Even the most loyal allies in the underworld were susceptible to fear, ambition, and pressure from law enforcement. Some were tempted by deals, others by promises of power, and a few simply feared the consequences of being associated with the quiet Don. Luciano understood that loyalty, while powerful, was fragile in the face of extreme pressure. The psychological tension of anticipating betrayal, balancing trust, and identifying double agents became an ever-present burden. Every interaction, every conversation, and every decision required a careful calculation, a recognition that even a minor lapse could trigger cascading consequences throughout his empire. The arrest that would mark the beginning of Luciano's fall was not sudden. It was the culmination of months of careful surveillance, informant reports, and law enforcement planning. For Luciano, who had always operated several steps ahead, the situation was both a challenge and a test of his resilience. His ability to maneuver, negotiate, and manipulate had always been his greatest strength, yet even the most skilled strategist can be cornered when the forces arrayed against him are coordinated, relentless, and backed by the full authority of the federal government. The arrest was swift and public, sending shockwaves through the underworld and signaling that the era of near-absolute impunity was over. Psychologically, the arrest represented more than just the threat of imprisonment. It was a challenge to Luciano's identity. For decades, he had navigated a world of power, influence, and calculated risk. To be captured, confined, and subjected to the scrutiny of courts and prosecutors was an inversion of the control he had always wielded. It forced him to confront the limitations of his influence and the fragility of even the most carefully constructed empire. Yet true to form, Luciano did not react with panic or despair. He analyzed the situation, weighing options, assessing allies, and planning strategies to mitigate the consequences. Even in the face of imminent downfall, his mind remained a calculating instrument, focused on survival, adaptation, and the possibility of reclaiming influence in the future. The social and emotional dimensions of this fall were equally profound. The criminal world, once responsive to his command, now watched with a mixture of fear, awe, and uncertainty. Allies wondered if their loyalty could protect them, rivals saw opportunity, and law enforcement gained leverage from the aura of vulnerability that surrounded him. Luciano had always understood the delicate interplay between perception and power, and yet, here he faced a scenario where perception alone could not shield him. The quiet Don, who had built his empire with subtlety, intellect, and psychological mastery, was now confronted with the raw force of law, betrayal, and consequence. Despite the arrest, Luciano's influence did not vanish immediately. He continued to exert control where possible, leveraging loyal allies, negotiating deals, and ensuring that his operations remained intact even as his personal freedom was curtailed. Yet the beginning of the fall was unmistakable. The empire he had spent decades constructing faced pressure on multiple fronts, the careful balance of alliances was disrupted, and the forces of justice were converging with precision. The arrest was more than a legal action. It was the first domino in a cascade that would eventually force Luciano to confront exile, the loss of absolute power, and the stark realities of mortality, loyalty, and consequence. This period underscores the inherent vulnerability in even the most masterful criminal enterprises. Luciano's rise had been methodical, calculated, and psychologically astute, yet it could not entirely shield him from external pressures and human unpredictability. The beginning of his fall reveals the paradox of power. The higher one climbs, the more visible and vulnerable one becomes. The streets that had once nurtured him, the networks that had supported him, and the empire he had orchestrated were now simultaneously his greatest strength and potential source of downfall. For Luciano, this was the start of a transformation that would test every skill he had cultivated, the art of survival, the limits of loyalty, and the resilience of a mind accustomed to controlling every variable. The courtroom that would determine Lucky Luciano's fate was not merely a stage for legal proceedings. It was a theater of power, perception, and spectacle watched closely by the public, the press, and the criminal underworld alike. By the time the trial began, Luciano was no longer just a man facing charges. He was a symbol, a lightning rod for debates about organized crime, morality, and the limits of law enforcement. Every word spoken, every gesture made, carried weight far beyond the immediate legal consequences. For the quiet Don, the trial represented both peril and opportunity, a final arena in which intellect, strategy, and psychological acuity could be leveraged to influence outcomes, even when the odds were stacked against him. The charges themselves were severe, encompassing a broad range of criminal activities, from extortion and racketeering to conspiracy and complicity in violent acts. Law enforcement and prosecutors presented evidence carefully assembled over months, combining witness testimony, informant reports and documentation intended to dismantle Luciano's carefully constructed empire. Each piece of evidence was framed not just as a factual account, but as part of a narrative designed to paint him as a ruthless, calculating mastermind responsible for corruption, fear, and violence throughout New York City. The courtroom became a battleground, with the prosecution seeking to make Luciano a cautionary example and the defense striving to mitigate damage while preserving credibility and influence. Luciano approached the trial with the same strategic mindset that had guided his rise. He was aware that public perception mattered as much as the jury's verdict, and that every interaction, every expression, and every argument could influence the broader narrative surrounding his empire. Lawyers, witnesses, and even sympathetic insiders were orchestrated with precision, ensuring that the quiet Don's image as both intelligent and composed remained intact. Despite the intense scrutiny, he maintained a calm exterior, projecting confidence and control even as the courtroom buzzed with tension, speculation, and the undercurrent of fear that accompanied anyone connected to organized crime. Media coverage amplified the stakes dramatically. Newspapers across the city followed the trial day by day, sensationalizing evidence, highlighting dramatic exchanges, and framing Luciano's story as both a crime epic and a cautionary tale. The public, fascinated by the intersection of wealth, violence, and strategy, watched as the underworld's most powerful figure faced justice. For Luciano, this media scrutiny was both a threat and a tool. He understood that shaping public perception could influence jurors, sway opinion, and preserve aspects of his reputation even in the event of a guilty verdict. Every glance, pause, and carefully chosen word became part of a larger performance, one in which psychological mastery could rival legal maneuvering. The courtroom drama itself revealed much about Luciano's character and the nature of organized crime at the time. Witnesses testified to acts of violence and coercion, detailing the intricate web of influence he had woven. Rival mobsters, some coerced and some cooperative, painted pictures of an empire maintained through subtlety, negotiation, and occasional brutality. The prosecution sought to highlight the moral depravity inherent in Luciano's operations, framing him as a figure whose intellect had been weaponized for crime. Yet even amid these depictions, the quiet Don's intelligence, foresight, and organizational genius could not be denied. Observers noted that he had transformed criminal enterprise into a system, a structure that mirrored legitimate business operations in its efficiency, control, and strategic vision. The trial was also a psychological theater. Luciano faced the tension of anticipating betrayals, cross-examinations, and hidden agendas from both prosecutors and potential informants. Loyalty was tested at every turn, with allies pressured to testify or manipulated into revealing damaging information. Luciano navigated these challenges with characteristic composure, using charm, intimidation, and strategic foresight to protect critical elements of his empire. Each day in court was a delicate negotiation between survival and exposure, control and vulnerability, perception and reality. The balance he maintained revealed the same psychological mastery that had guided his rise, the ability to remain several steps ahead of every opponent, anticipating their moves, and shaping outcomes even when constrained by circumstance. Ultimately, the trial culminated in a verdict that would reshape Luciano's life: conviction. The sentence was severe, underscoring both the legal system's intent to punish and the public desire for accountability. For the quiet Don, it marked the first major interruption in a career characterized by calculated ascent, psychological manipulation, and systemic control. Yet even in the face of judgment, Luciano's mind remained active, focused on mitigating consequences, preserving influence, and planning for the future. Prison was not merely confinement, it was another battlefield, another arena in which strategy, foresight, and alliances would determine survival and continued influence. The trial also had profound ramifications for the underworld. Allies and rivals alike were forced to recalibrate their strategies, adjusting to the temporary absence of Luciano's direct control. The careful balance of loyalty, fear, and cooperation he had maintained was tested under the pressure of his imprisonment. Yet his systems, alliances, and organizational foresight ensured that his empire did not collapse entirely, demonstrating the durability of the structures he had meticulously created. Even a conviction could not erase the influence he had ingrained within the criminal ecosystem. His legacy of power, strategy, and control had been deeply embedded. In the broader context, the trial exemplified the paradox of Luciano's genius. He had risen through violence, cunning, and intellect, building an empire of unprecedented sophistication, only to face the immutable forces of law and accountability. Yet even in the courtroom his presence was formidable. his intelligence, strategic foresight, and psychological acuity on full display. The trial was more than legal procedure. It was a stage upon which the Quiet Don's legacy, methods, and mastery of human behavior were on public display, leaving a lasting impression on both the underworld and the general populace. This chapter of Luciano's life underscores the inherent tension between power and vulnerability. Even the most brilliant architect of organized crime could not entirely evade law, betrayal, and consequence. Yet through strategy, psychological insight, and the careful orchestration of perception, Luciano ensured that his influence, reputation, and systems remained formidable, even in the face of personal loss. The trial was both an end and a beginning, a moment of accountability, and a prelude to the next phase of his complex, remarkable, and enduring story. Even behind the bars of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence refused to wane. The Quiet Don, a man who had built an empire through strategic alliances, psychological insight, and meticulous organization, understood that physical confinement could never entirely sever the webs of power he had woven over decades. Prison, while restrictive, became another arena in which he could exercise control, manipulate outcomes, and assert authority over a world that had always operated at his discretion. To Luciano, imprisonment was not merely punishment, it was a challenge, an obstacle to navigate with the same foresight, calculation, and patience that had defined his rise. The first task in maintaining power from prison was communication. Luciano had long recognized that information was as vital as money or muscle. Through a network of loyal intermediaries, including former lieutenants, attorneys, and even prison staff, he was able to continue directing operations, issuing instructions, and negotiating disputes. His influence extended to the management of bootlegging, gambling, and union operations outside the prison walls, ensuring that the empire he had painstakingly built remained intact. Every order, every message, and every strategic decision was calculated to maintain loyalty, preempt challenges, and safeguard the empire's continuity. Psychological acumen became even more critical during this period. Luciano understood that perception often mattered as much as reality. Within prison he projected an image of calm authority and unwavering control, cultivating respect from both inmates and guards. His reputation as a strategist and problem-solver preceded him, and this aura of competence and fear ensured that he was treated with deference. Inmates sought his guidance, while guards and administrators recognized that cooperating with him was preferable to confrontation. In this way, Luciano turned a position of apparent vulnerability into one of influence, reinforcing the idea that power was not solely a function of freedom, but of intellect, strategy, and perception. Alliances outside the prison walls were equally essential. Luciano maintained regular contact with trusted lieutenants, who acted as extensions of his will, executing his plans, managing conflicts, and ensuring that rival factions did not exploit his absence. Loyalty was continually tested and reinforced through incentives, strategic rewards, and occasional demonstrations of the consequences of disobedience. Luciano's careful orchestration of these relationships meant that his empire remained cohesive, disciplined, and resilient even when he could not personally oversee operations. The system he had created functioned as an extension of his mind, allowing him to remain a central figure of power despite physical confinement. In addition to managing his empire, Luciano also leveraged his position in prison to expand influence in unexpected ways. He identified opportunities to cooperate with government agencies, particularly as the United States faced the looming threat of global conflict. Luciano's expertise in logistics, contacts, and organizational networks made him valuable to authorities seeking to coordinate operations related to the war effort, particularly in securing ports and preventing sabotage. By negotiating his cooperation, he was able to gain favor with the federal government while demonstrating his capacity to wield influence even under restrictive circumstances. This dual role, both criminal mastermind and pragmatic collaborator, enhanced his strategic leverage, positioning him for a potential post-prison return to power. Maintaining control from prison was not without risks. Rival factions continually tested boundaries, hoping to exploit his confinement and disrupt the networks he had built. Yet Luciano's foresight allowed him to anticipate challenges, employ intermediaries strategically, and adapt operations to counter threats. He understood that power was dynamic, requiring constant attention and recalibration. Even small mistakes could cascade into crises, but Luciano's disciplined, analytical approach minimized vulnerabilities and ensured that his authority remained largely unchallenged. Prison also offered a unique perspective on loyalty, hierarchy, and influence. Observing the interactions of inmates, guards, and officials, Luciano refined his understanding of human behavior under pressure. He could identify weaknesses, anticipate conflicts, and manipulate outcomes with the same precision he had applied to organized crime. This period of confinement reinforced the principles that had guided his rise: patience, observation, strategic leverage, and psychological insight. Every decision, every negotiation, and every interaction became an opportunity to strengthen influence, maintain control, and prepare for eventual freedom. By the time his sentence had progressed, it was clear that Luciano's empire had endured remarkably well despite his incarceration. The five families continued to operate with discipline, rivalries were managed, and his strategic systems remained intact. His influence, carefully maintained through intermediaries and psychological mastery, demonstrated the resilience of a criminal empire built on intellect, foresight, and organizational innovation. Luciano's capacity to govern from behind bars was a testament not only to his genius as a strategist but to his understanding of the enduring principles of power, loyalty, and human behavior. In this chapter of his life, Luciano revealed a crucial truth: true power is not limited by physical constraints. Even confined, the quiet Don wielded authority, orchestrated operations, and influenced outcomes with precision. His empire had become a living system, capable of functioning independently yet inseparably connected to his will. Prison was not an end but a crucible, an environment that tested, refined, and ultimately confirmed the depth of his genius as a master of strategy, influence, and organized crime. Luciano's release from prison did not mark a return to the empire he had once commanded, but it signaled the beginning of a new and complex chapter, one defined by exile, reflection, and a shifting understanding of power. In 1946, after serving a substantial portion of his sentence, he was deported to Italy, a land that was simultaneously foreign and familiar. For a man whose identity had been forged in the streets of New York, whose power had radiated through the five families, exile was a profound dislocation. It was a forced removal from the networks he had painstakingly built, a separation from the city that had become both his playground and his battlefield. Yet even in displacement, Luciano remained a strategist, a thinker, and a man determined to maintain influence in whatever sphere he occupied. Italy, however, presented its own set of challenges. Post-war recovery had left the country politically unstable and economically fragile. Luciano arrived in a world very different from the bustling metropolis of his youth, a place where old mafia structures persisted but lacked the organization and efficiency he had cultivated in America. He quickly recognized that his authority, which had been absolute in New York, would be contingent upon careful negotiation, subtle alliances, and strategic positioning. Exile required a different set of skills: diplomacy, patience, and the ability to exert influence without the immediate leverage of his American empire. The transition was both professional and psychological, forcing Luciano to reconcile the limitations of his current situation with the ambitions that had always driven him. Despite these constraints, Luciano's mind remained active, scanning opportunities and evaluating the terrain. He maintained connections across the Atlantic, keeping in touch with trusted lieutenants in the United States who continued to operate the five families. Through letters, intermediaries, and carefully orchestrated communications, he remained involved in strategic decisions, influencing disputes, business ventures, and alliances from afar. His role shifted from direct command to advisory influence, but the principles he had established, the systems, loyalties, and protocols, continued to operate under his guidance. Even in exile, Luciano's ability to shape outcomes underscored the durability of the structures he had created. Exile also provided space for reflection. Removed from the immediate pressures of power, Luciano had the opportunity to contemplate his life, decisions, and the legacy he would leave behind. Accounts suggest a man both proud and pragmatic, aware of his accomplishments but also conscious of the costs. Betrayals endured, friendships tested, and lives destroyed in the pursuit of control. The psychological weight of this reflection was immense, yet it did not diminish his strategic outlook. Rather, it allowed him to refine his understanding of influence, human behavior, and the nature of organized power, lessons that would continue to inform his actions until the end of his life. In Italy, Luciano also engaged in new ventures, both legitimate and illicit. He observed the post-war reconstruction, recognizing opportunities in commerce, logistics, and networks of influence that transcended national borders. While his operations could never replicate the scope or profitability of the New York Empire, they allowed him to maintain relevance and control in a different context. Luciano had always demonstrated an ability to adapt, and exile was no exception. He leveraged his intelligence, connections, and reputation to carve a niche in a world that was both familiar and foreign, demonstrating that power is not solely defined by geography but by strategy, perception, and relationships. The philosophical dimension of this period is significant. Exile forced Luciano to confront the limitations of his ambition and the inevitability of change. For a man accustomed to near absolute control, the realization that influence could be constrained by borders, law, and circumstance was profound. Yet Luciano approached these challenges with the same intellect and composure that had defined his life. He understood that power could persist in forms beyond immediate dominance, through guidance, legacy, and the careful shaping of networks. Exile became less a punishment and more a stage upon which to exercise subtle influence, maintain relevance, and continue the orchestration of a life defined by strategy. By the early 1950s, Luciano's role had clearly shifted from that of an active mob boss to a master strategist and elder statesman of organized crime. His insights were sought by both allies and adversaries, and his reputation remained formidable. While removed from the daily operations of the five families, his influence continued to shape decisions, resolve conflicts, and maintain the balance of power established decades earlier. His exile highlighted the enduring strength of systems, structures, and relationships that he had built, a testament to the genius of his organizational vision. The final years of Luciano's life were marked by a mixture of reflection, strategic observation, and adaptation. Exile did not diminish his intellect, and it did not erase the legacy he had created in America. It offered, instead, a different vantage point, a position from which to observe, influence, and prepare for eventual opportunities while contending with the realities of mortality, displacement, and the changing landscape of organized crime. The quiet Don, even in exile, remained a figure whose life, decisions, and strategies would echo far beyond his immediate surroundings, leaving an indelible mark on the history of criminal organization worldwide. Luciano's exile and endgame demonstrate the enduring tension between power and limitation, ambition and circumstance, strategy and inevitability. They reveal a man who, even when stripped of physical control over his empire, understood the deeper mechanics of influence, loyalty, and human behavior. Exile was a new battlefield, a test of adaptation, and a confirmation of the enduring genius that had allowed Lucky Luciano to shape organized crime in ways that would reverberate for generations. In this final chapter, he was no longer the active conqueror of streets and families, but the masterful strategist observing the world from a distance, ensuring that the legacy of his vision would persist long after he had departed the stage. Lucky Luciano's legacy is both vast and paradoxical, a tapestry woven from brilliance, ambition, and ruthlessness. To the public, he was a criminal mastermind, a man whose empire of gambling, bootlegging, and union manipulation seemed untouchable. To the underworld, he was a visionary, a strategist whose ability to orchestrate complex operations, manage human behavior, and maintain loyalty had redefined the very notion of organized crime. But beyond reputation and wealth, Luciano's true legacy lies in the systems he created, a blueprint for modern organized crime that would endure long after his death. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Luciano's legacy was the institutionalization of organized crime itself. Before his rise, the mafia in America was fragmented, chaotic, and often prone to violent overreach that threatened its own survival. Rival gangs fought endlessly for territory and dominance, and alliances were fleeting. Luciano transformed this instability into order. Through careful planning, negotiation, and the creation of the five-family structure, he centralized authority while maintaining a balance that allowed each faction autonomy within a regulated system. His organizational vision emphasized efficiency, discipline, and predictability, principles that allowed the criminal enterprise to thrive with less internal chaos and greater longevity. Luciano's innovations extended beyond structural design to include the application of business principles to illegal enterprise. He treated gambling operations, bootlegging networks, and labor rackets as integrated economic systems. Profits were maximized not through reckless violence but through strategic leverage, market control, and the manipulation of supply chains. This approach was revolutionary for its time. Luciano viewed crime not as random acts of predation but as a sophisticated network of mutually reinforcing ventures. His strategies emphasized sustainability, risk management, and long-term gain over immediate gratification, a mindset that transformed the mafia from a collection of street thugs into a disciplined, enduring institution. Psychology was another cornerstone of Luciano's enduring influence. He understood the human element of power in ways few of his contemporaries did. Loyalty was cultivated through respect, fear, and opportunity, Influence was extended through perception and strategic relationships. He recognized that power was as much about how others perceived him as it was about tangible control of resources or territory. This insight allowed him to maintain authority even when physically removed from the epicenter of operations, whether behind prison walls or in exile. By mastering the minds of allies and rivals alike, Luciano created a psychological framework for leadership that would become as influential as his organizational methods. The repercussions of Luciano's methods were felt not only in New York or even the United States, but across the globe. Organized crime in the post-war era drew heavily on the principles he had established. Hierarchical structures, diversified operations, and strategic alliances became standard features of criminal organizations far beyond America's borders. The systems he had perfected were replicated, adapted, and refined by generations of mobsters, proving that his influence extended well beyond his lifetime. In this sense, Luciano was not merely a criminal figure, he was an architect of a new paradigm in the global underworld, a man whose methods and strategies shaped the future of organized crime. Luciano's legacy is also defined by the delicate interplay of loyalty, betrayal, and survival. His life illustrated that power is never static. It requires constant management of relationships, perception, and human behavior. He demonstrated that influence could be maintained through strategic foresight, psychological insight, and systemic control, rather than brute force alone. The balance he achieved between fear and respect, aggression and diplomacy, autonomy and control, became a model emulated by criminal leaders for decades. By codifying these principles, Luciano ensured that the lessons of his empire would endure as both practical strategies and cautionary examples. Yet his legacy is not without moral and ethical ambiguity. Luciano's brilliance came at immense human cost. Countless lives were affected by violence, coercion, and exploitation. His empire, while structured and efficient, was built upon fear, manipulation, and criminal enterprise. This duality, genius intertwined with ruthlessness, vision shadowed by moral compromise, is central to understanding why he remains such a compelling historical figure. It is the tension between his intellect and his crimes, his strategic mind and his moral failings, that continues to fascinate scholars, journalists, and the public alike. Moreover, Luciano's life reshaped perceptions of criminal leadership. He demonstrated that a successful mob boss needed to be more than violent or charismatic. He needed to be a strategist, an organizer, and a psychologist. Influence could be extended without direct involvement in every operation, and power could be maintained through networks, alliances, and foresight. This intellectualization of criminal enterprise elevated organized crime to a systematized and disciplined practice, redefining the possibilities for those who followed in his footsteps. Ultimately, Lucky Luciano's legacy is one of enduring influence, a testament to the power of intellect, organization, and strategy within the underworld. He created a template for modern organized crime that combined structural innovation, psychological mastery, and economic acumen. His life remains a study in contrasts: brilliance and brutality, loyalty and betrayal, vision and moral ambiguity. The systems he built, the strategies he employed, and the psychological frameworks he mastered ensured that his impact would echo far beyond his lifetime, making him not only one of the most powerful figures in American criminal history but also one of its most enduring architects. Through the lens of history, Luciano's story serves as both a lesson and a warning. That power, when wielded with intellect and foresight, can achieve remarkable durability, yet it is always intertwined with human cost and moral compromise. The Quiet Don's empire, though dismantled in many practical senses, left behind principles, structures, and psychological insights that continue to shape the anatomy of organized crime to this day, ensuring that his name and methods remain central to understanding the modern underworld. By the time Lucky Luciano's life drew to a close, the man who had once orchestrated the most sophisticated criminal empire in New York had become something larger than himself. A symbol, a legend, and a cautionary tale rolled into one. The Quiet Don's journey from the poverty-stricken streets of Sicily to the glittering, dangerous avenues of Manhattan was not just a story of crime or ambition, but a story about the human capacity for strategy, adaptation, and survival in a world ruled as much by fear and perception as by force. His life was a series of contrasts: ruthless yet intelligent, feared yet admired, morally ambiguous yet methodically principled in the ways that mattered to him. Luciano's rise had been fueled by a keen understanding of human behavior, an almost instinctual ability to read ambition, fear, and desire. Unlike the brute enforcers of the era who relied solely on violence to maintain control, he combined intelligence with psychological insight. He understood that people could be motivated not just by fear, but by respect, loyalty, or a calculated sense of self-interest. He cultivated alliances that were mutually beneficial, manipulated rivals into submission, and maintained a network of influence that extended far beyond his immediate surroundings. This was the genius of Luciano, the ability to see not only the present but the future, to anticipate the actions of allies and enemies, and to design a system of control that could endure beyond his direct supervision. Yet even the greatest architects of power are vulnerable to forces beyond their control, and Luciano's story is inseparable from the narrative of human limitation and consequence. His eventual arrest, trial, imprisonment, and deportation were stark reminders that no empire, however brilliant, can exist entirely outside the reach of law, circumstance, and human unpredictability. Even in these moments of vulnerability, however, Luciano demonstrated a resilience and ingenuity that few could match. He did not merely endure. He adapted, turning imprisonment and exile into arenas in which his intellect and influence could continue to operate. From behind bars and from across the Atlantic, he ensured that the structures he had built remained functional, that his lieutenants continued to execute his vision, and that the underworld itself remained aware of his enduring authority. The psychological complexity of Luciano's life cannot be overstated. He was a man whose intelligence was matched by ambition, whose strategic mind was paired with an awareness of human frailty. He knew the costs of betrayal, both for himself and for those who served him, and he used this knowledge to maintain discipline, order, and loyalty in his empire. Yet he was also human, capable of reflection, aware of the moral compromises inherent in his choices, and perhaps even burdened at times by the consequences of his actions. In exile especially, there was space for contemplation, a forced pause that illuminated both his brilliance and the shadows of his life. For all his cunning and foresight, Luciano remained subject to the immutable truths of mortality, displacement, and the limitations imposed by external forces. The broader impact of Luciano's life is perhaps even more significant than the personal story of his rise and fall. His organizational innovations, which transformed the mafia from a disorganized collection of gangs into a hierarchical and disciplined network, have had lasting repercussions on the structure of organized crime worldwide. The Five Families model he perfected in New York became a template for criminal organizations across the United States and even internationally. Hierarchy, codified loyalty, territorial respect, and economic integration were principles that endured long after Luciano's death. By professionalizing crime in this way, he created a system that was more sustainable, resilient, and difficult to dismantle, setting a precedent that continues to shape organized crime to this day. Beyond structure, Luciano's genius lay in his application of business principles to illicit enterprises. Gambling, bootlegging, labor rackets, and smuggling were not simply sources of revenue, they were components of a strategically managed portfolio. Luciano understood the importance of diversifying operations, managing risk, and exploiting opportunities for maximum efficiency. Violence was not random, it was a tool to enforce loyalty, eliminate threats, or send strategic messages. By treating crime as a system rather than a series of impulsive acts, Luciano ensured the longevity of his empire and elevated the mafia from street-level chaos to organized power capable of influencing politics, unions, and commerce. Equally significant was Luciano's mastery of public perception. He understood that power was not only about control over territory or money, it was about narrative. Maintaining a reputation that commanded respect and inspired fear was central to his strategy. Even when facing legal prosecution, imprisonment, and eventual deportation, Luciano managed to manipulate perception, ensuring that his influence remained potent. The courtroom, the media, and the public gaze became another battlefield on which he operated with the precision and foresight that had defined his career. The quiet Don's ability to project authority, even under extreme duress, reinforced the mythos surrounding him and ensured that his name would endure far beyond the confines of his physical empire. Luciano's life also highlights the moral ambiguity inherent in power. He was both architect and destroyer, strategist and enforcer, visionary and criminal. Millions were affected by his actions, from those who lived under his protection to those who suffered violence, coercion, or exploitation. His brilliance cannot be separated from the human cost, and this tension between genius and ruthlessness is central to understanding why his story continues to captivate and provoke debate. It is a narrative that forces reflection on the nature of influence, the responsibilities of power, and the ethical compromises that often accompany the pursuit of control. Exile and the final years of Luciano's life add yet another layer to this complex portrait. Removed from the direct levers of power, he continued to exert influence, observing, advising, and shaping outcomes from afar. His capacity to remain relevant, to navigate new environments, and to maintain strategic leverage even in displacement, illustrates a rare combination of adaptability and psychological insight. In Italy, far from the streets of New York, Luciano demonstrated that power is not merely a function of geography, force, or wealth, but of vision, intellect, and the ability to influence the decisions of others through strategy and foresight. The Quiet Don's legacy also resonates in cultural memory. He has become a symbol of organized crime, a reference point for studies in leadership, strategy, and human behavior. Films, books, and documentaries continue to explore his life, dissecting his methods and moral calculus, and using his story to illuminate the broader dynamics of power, loyalty, and ambition. In this way, Luciano transcends his historical moment. He is simultaneously a figure of history, a case study in psychology and strategy, and a cautionary exemplar of the moral complexities that accompany extraordinary ambition. In contemplating the totality of Luciano's life, one sees the intertwining of brilliance and vulnerability, vision and consequence, strategy and human limitation. He achieved unprecedented influence through intellect, foresight, and psychological mastery, yet he was never immune to the forces of law, betrayal, or mortality. His story underscores the paradoxes of power, that it can be enduring yet precarious, systemic yet personal, commanding yet morally ambiguous. Luciano's life teaches that influence is multidimensional, requiring skill, patience, and an understanding of human nature that extends far beyond brute strength or charisma. Ultimately, the life of Lucky Luciano is a study in contrasts, a narrative that oscillates between triumph and loss, intellect and ruthlessness, myth and human reality. His influence on organized crime is undeniable, shaping structures, methods, and strategies that persist to this day. His psychological acuity, strategic vision, and mastery of perception ensured that even when removed from the streets, he remained a figure of power, respect, and fear. Yet the human story, the decisions, the betrayals, the moral compromises, remain central, reminding us that even the most formidable figures are subject to the same complexities, contradictions, and consequences that define all human endeavor. The Quiet Don's story closes not with violence or spectacle, but with reflection and resonance. He is remembered as an architect of organized crime, a master strategist, and a man whose intellect shaped systems, relationships, and human behavior on a grand scale. Yet he is also remembered as a man of moral ambiguity, a figure whose brilliance came at tremendous human cost, and a symbol of the delicate balance between ambition and consequence. Luciano's life, in all its complexity, stands as a testament to the enduring interplay of power, intellect, psychology, and morality, a story that continues to captivate, teach, and provoke reflection nearly a century after he first rose to prominence. In the end, the legend of Lucky Luciano is inseparable from the man himself. The Quiet Don, with his calculated calm, his strategic foresight, and his mastery of human behavior, created an empire that survived and evolved even in his absence. His story is one of brilliance intertwined with moral compromise, influence shaped by psychology as much as by force, and a life defined by both extraordinary achievement and profound vulnerability. It is a story that continues to echo through history, offering lessons about power, ambition, and human nature that remain relevant to this day. In reflecting on Luciano's life, we are reminded that genius is often inseparable from imperfection, that influence is never absolute, and that the legacy of a man is measured not only by the power he wields but by the enduring impact of his vision, strategy, and intellect.